Hello, and welcome to the Ancient Art of Organum by me, your professor, David Bashwiner. So, first question, which I'm sure you are asking at this point, what is organum? In ancient Greek, the term organum meant tool, and the term was sometimes used to refer to musical instruments of any sort. It was later related to words such as an organ of the body, like the heart, the liver, etc. And it also is related to the word organized, and that becomes interesting because it's certainly related to consonants in music and how consonants organizes harmony and melody. So in the early Christian period, from around the time of Christ to around 800 of the Common Era, 800 AD, organum, that term, could refer to either a musical instrument or the property of consonants between sounds. And it's important to note that in the early Christian period, only singing was allowed in church. Instruments weren't allowed, they were outlawed. So, people would ride in on their horses and shoot everything up and then bring their instruments in, that kind of thing. An influential biblical passage, and I really don't know which one, I think it's in the Psalms, required that praise to God be sung in one voice. And thus only single lines of chant were allowed. That's why we have things like Gregorian chant and those other kinds of chant that are also like Gregorian, Roman chant, etc. The earliest polyphonic singing, so polyphonic meaning two voices, we'll look at that on the next screen, which is called organum, was considered to be rebellious. And therefore it was resisted by the church, although on and off for centuries until about 1200. So for 300, 400 years, people started doing it, and then sometimes they would allow it in church, and sometimes they really wouldn't. So as this two-part singing, which is called organum, emerges, it always results from a newly composed line being added to a pre-existing chant melody. That pre-existing chant melody in today's lecture is going to be called the vox principalis, the voice principle. But then eventually, starting next week, we're going to just call it the cantus firmus, which means chant, firm chant, the given melody. And then the newly added line is initially this point called the vox originalis, right? The organal voice. And then later we're just going to call it the contrapuntal voice. So eventually we'll have a cantus firmus, which is a melody that already exists, and a contrapuntal voice that's added. And then eventually the term organum is used to refer to multi-part singing in general. The whole piece could be called a piece of organum, or just that passage could be said to be a passage of organum. So, in sum, organum means early singing in two parts. And this is in Europe from around 850 or 800 to about 1300. Now, I threw in a screen here about musical textures. This is mentioned at the end of chapter 1 in your book. It could be 1b, I can't remember. But these are the official and rather stodgy terms. There's monophony, which is called monody in sometimes, like in the early Baroque era, it's called monody, monophony, one sound. So it usually means a single voice melody. It means a single melody, a melody performed by one voice. And then I'm going to note later on in the screen that voice, quote unquote, could be a whole bunch of people singing the same melody. So it really is a single melody. Sometimes in this tradition, like in the monody tradition, it's the singing voice is the main one, but then there's a very sparse accompaniment in the background, and that's still considered monody or monophony. But for the most part, monophony means one voice. So then you have something called heterophony. And heterophony is multiple voices singing the same melody simultaneously, but each of them ornamenting it in their own way. Something that's not super common in Western art music, but it really is common in traditions all over the world, and it's common actually in like early Christian American singing. So then there's homophony, and it's hard to tell what it means from the word. Homophony just means, I guess, unified phony, unified sounds. So in this case, it really means that the rhythm is the same. All the voices have the same rhythm, and then if it's a choir and they're singing words, then they all have the same words, but they're singing different notes. So they might be singing together on the chord, and the chords might be changing, etc. An example of this, a classic example, is just hymn singing in the Protestant tradition. You go to a Protestant church, you open up the book of hymns, and then everyone's singing in 4 parts. And then Anglican chant is this other version that's pretty cool, where they basically take a Gregorian chant, they harmonize it a little bit, and then they perform it. But it sounds really different from hymn singing because it's kind of arrhythmic in the way that Gregorian chant is. And then last but not least, is polyphony, many phonies, many voices. So it means more than one voice, and the different voices differ from one another in both their notes and their rhythms. So it's not just that they have different notes, because that would be like homophony, but they also have different rhythms. And then a classical example of this is counterpoint. So polyphony and counterpoint kind of mean the same thing. And it's important to note that the different rhythms tend to separate the voices in the listener's mind. And I just threw in here that polyphony is often thought of as the highest achievement of Western art music. And what we're looking at today is some of the beginnings of polyphony. So I wanted to point out a couple things. All of this stuff applies not just to voices, but also to instrumental music. So monophony, heterophony, homophony, polyphony. I'm always talking about more than one voice or one voice, etc., but that applies to instrument lines. So this term voice, it's often used abstractly to refer to all the instruments playing a certain line or all the singers singing it. So for instance, the tenor voice in a choir might be many different people, many different tenors, all singing the same tenor line, but you just call it one voice. So if you look on the music, it'll look like there's 4 voices. There might be 25, there might be 100 people singing it, but there's just 4 different voices. So the voice is a kind of abstract thing. And then much orchestral music is also written for 4 voices, even if it's played by up to 100 people. So it's the same kind of idea. So for instance, the basses, like the string basses, very often double the cellos just an octave below. And that's so often that up until the middle of Beethoven's career, he and everybody else just didn't even write out a separate bass part. They would just assume that the basses are going to read the cello part. Second violins often double the first violins an octave below. Oh, by the way, I point out that 8VB means octave below, 8VA means octave above. Okay. Bassoons often double either the cellos or the violas, right? Flutes often double the violins. So if the flutes are doubling the violins, whatever both the flutes and the violins are playing is just considered one voice. That's the idea here. And then one other kind of cool thing about this to think about is that there are 4-part choirs within each of the instrument groups. So the woodwinds have their own 4-part choir. Instead of soprano, alto, tenor, bass, they have flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, right? That's their soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Within the brass, you have the trumpets, the French horns, the trombones, and I guess maybe the tubas. I'm not really sure actually how that one works. And then within the strings, you have the violins. Violin 1, violin 2 would be like soprano and alto. And then viola is tenor. And then cello is bass. And that's usually doubled by the string bass. So, and then last note on this is that fancy piano music, not just any piano music, no, pretty much any piano music, it sounds fancy and sounds like a whole bunch of stuff is going on, but it is often just very highly ornamented 4-part texture. So you can often take a fancy piece of piano music and reduce it to 4-part texture. So as you're learning to write in 4 parts, which you ultimately do in this class, it does allow you to write for, more than 4 parts. 4 parts is kind of like a standard grammar, at least of Western classical music. So then one last question is, where does the texture of melody and accompaniment fit in? That's one of the most common things. If you just write a song on the guitar or piano where you're singing and playing chords, or you're singing in the uke, right? That is just standard melody and accompaniment texture. It's not really obvious. That's why these terms are not super awesome. It could be there under monophony. If you allow some accompaniment in the background, then there's a solo voice. If you write a song, maybe like the focus is on the voice and there's just some very light guitar or uke or piano or whatever in the background to support it. If the chords are always changing at the same time words are, you can think of it as homophony. If the chords are doing something more fancy, you could think of it as polyphony. If you think about jazz improvisation, the way it's written out is usually kind of like monophony. It's a solo voice and then there's chords just labeled above. But then with everybody playing it all the time, everybody improvising in their own way, it's either heterophony or polyphony. Okay, so maybe just experiment in your mind with these terms and see what you think of them. So let's get back to organum. I want to talk to you about the earliest forms of organum. So as I said on a previous screen, one of the meanings of organum was similar etymological relationship of organum is organized, and this meant precisely measured. So the organized intervals, as we talked about in the interval video, organized intervals were the perfect consonances, the perfect fourth, perfect fifth, perfect octave. Also, of course, the perfect unison. You don't have to measure all that much for the unison. But if you measure the length of a string, 2 to 1 is an octave, 3 to 2 is a fifth, 4 to 3 is a fourth, right? So you can measure those exactly, and those are considered the perfect intervals. And they're also the most organized. So those are the ones that people are actually using the most in organum, in early organum. And the earliest organum was improvisational, not written out in the score. And the reason I think that that is important is because it's well after people are already performing organum that they start writing it down. So when you're thinking about what organum is, you might want to think about how you could perform organum, how you could start singing in multiple parts with someone else without writing anything down, sort of off the top of your head. Some techniques are more easily applied using only the workspace of the mind in this way that I'm talking about. So to do organum in parallel, that's the first thing we're going to look at. I encourage you to try this at home with a family member or with a friend. I think it's hard to do over Zoom because of the time delay. But if there's anyone that you can make music with that you see in person, just try this. It'll be fun. So the vox originalis, which is the added voice, is going to sing the same melody as the vox principalis, but transposed up or down by a fourth or a fifth. So just a quick example. I think you'll be able to hear this. I'm just going to do it for a brief moment with Happy Birthday. If I took that and I'm going to do it at the fifth above. Oops, sorry. So, and I'm going to do the same thing at the fifth above. And I'm just going to play them at the same time. Okay, so you could really do that with family member or friend or someone else that you play music with. You could just say, let's play Happy Birthday. I'm going to start on G. You start on D. But then you play it as if it's in the key that you're in. I'll play it in the key I'm in. Okay, try that. See if it works. Another thing that you can do without having to write anything down is just to add a drone. So I'll go ahead and put a drone down here. And I'll play that same melody. So you can imagine with voices, that'll sound pretty interesting. And some of those intervals are really nice and crunchy. That one, right? Major seventh. So really dig into that crunchiness and try to tune those up and see how it sounds. So this is some of the early ways that you can have multi-part singing where the voices are doing different things, but you don't have to write anything down. You could do it just off the top of your head. So, and then just the definition of the drone thing is that the vox originalis, right? That's the added voice, is just holding the single note. I did this in C, so it's Happy Birthday. I put a C down there, and then I started the principal voice on G, the fifth. Okay, so you can try that on your own. By the way, you can also try it by you just playing one of the voices on the piano or the organ or your instrument, and then singing the other one. Okay, so by 1100, the introduction of parallel organum is happening around 850 CE. So by 1100, alternation between these various techniques becomes not just that people are doing it, because it seems like they're doing it earlier, but it becomes expressly allowed, meaning like all of a sudden the church is like, okay, you're allowed to go back and forth between the fourth and the fifth. You're allowed to enter into the drone technique and then go back into parallel technique, etc. So we're going to see an example of that on the next page. And this could require, or at least promote, the use of written notation to coordinate the greater complexity. So if you were going to try to oscillate between these techniques off the top of your head, you could still do it, but it might be kind of hard. So we'll see a written version and the following screen, not the screen. So this is going to be just parallel organum at the fifth. And this is from a treatise called the Scholia Incuriatus. You don't have to know what that means, but it's just one of these it's the first treatise in Western music, and I think in any music, that talks about polyphony, multiple voices. So In this case, the vox principalis is the top voice. So the cantus firmus, the main voice is the top voice. I'm going to play that. And I just want to point out to you, notice the little 8 under the treble clef. That means it would be played down an octave. So I'll go ahead and play this A as if it were an A at the top of the bass clef staff. So it's going to be this A an octave below. So I'm going to play the melody. This is the top line. Okay, and then let's say I know that melody and you know that melody, and I say, hey, you just sing it a fifth below me. I'll start here and you start here. So when you sing, you're going to go, I'm starting on the D, right? Just an octave below. So same exact melody, just a fifth below. And then when you play them together, yeah. So that's all fifths. Now, question would be, are these all perfect fifths? I said that the top line plays the melody and the bottom line goes a fifth below and then does it exactly. So as this line goes up a major second and down a major second and down a major second, down a major second, etc. This one's doing exactly the same thing. Up major second, down a major second, down a major second, down a major second. Notice that you have a B natural and a B flat. That's actually pretty weird in music today. Music the last 500 years or so. But that was the way this was done in 800, 850. Okay, so are these all perfect fifths? They should be. D to A, perfect fifth. E to B, D to A, C to G, B flat to F. Yes, these are all perfect fifths. Why did the person put in the B flats? Well, if we get rid of the flats, get rid of that B flat, then you'd have F down to B natural. That would be a diminished fifth instead of a perfect fifth. So they're peppering in some accidentals to make all these fifths perfect. Now, for the same melody, right, but it's just down a fourth below. So the melody again, then originally we did it here at the fifth. Now we're just going to do it at the fourth. And you could do either one of these, right? You know, they're at a party, they say, let's do it at the fifth below. And then they're like, oh, that was fun, let's do it at the fourth below. So this is the bottom line. I'll start again at the bottom line. Okay. Now, are all these fourths perfect fourths? E to A is perfect fourth, F sharp to B, E to A, C to, this is F natural, interestingly, if it's a perfect fourth. So this sharp does not carry over. Why did they put in the sharp? Well, it's because if they didn't, B to F would be an augmented fourth. It would sound like this. But they want the perfect fourths. Yeah. And how do you know to add in F sharp here instead of adding a B flat there? It's just because this melody is already given, right? It's the cantus firmus. It's the chant. It's the firmly fixed chant. So you can't change the melody. So you have to just put perfect fourths below each of these. Okay. Now, finally, I have some examples. This is just a different melody. It's a melody we're going to look at on the next page. But here it is in organum at the fifth. So you're going to hear, I think you hear the melody first and then organum at the fifth. We'll see. Okay, so that was the melody. Like I said, it's not on this page. You're not looking at anything. And now here's that same melody. And I think it's going to be at the fifth below. Okay, here it is. Okay, So let's say you are a budding composer and you know a melody and you say, I want to start writing this melody for multiple voices. Well, the first and simple thing that you can do is just harmonize it at the perfect fifth below or the perfect fourth below. And you could also do it above too, but in these examples, it's going below. So that's the first idea, parallel fifths and parallel fourths. And maybe I should just point out that eventually, once we get up to around 1500 and later, you will not be able to use parallel fifths at all anymore. So don't get too comfortable. But you're learning what parallel fifths are and what they sound like, so that's a good thing. Okay, so this is also from that same treatise, and it's going to combine a bunch of these different things. So first, listen to this example. Let me show you. You got normal musical notation here. The vox principalis is the voice that is the chant voice. That's all in the white notes, right? And then the added voice, the organal voice, that's all the filled in notes, okay? So it's two voices. And then in this old treatise, they do this cool thing where, like, they hadn't actually invented staff notation yet. So they do have these weird symbols, but these weird symbols just mean that these are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So like white notes of the piano. And they're showing you that you see, like, they're writing the words in the blanks here on G. So that it's G, G, A, B, C, C, B, G. Right, it's just the notes that are here. So in the original treatise, they didn't write the notes because they didn't have a way of writing notes yet. So they're doing it like this. Okay, cool early version of notation. Here's what it sounds like. Pretty awesome. So you get the section where the organal voice is just droning. Get another section where it's going in parallel fourths below. And then at the cadence, you just see them converging on E, which is probably the final. And they're actually moving in parallel unisons. So I'd point out here that those parallel unisons are actually allowed at this point. Later on, if you're writing polyphony, right, separate voices, you're not going to allow parallel unisons, you're not going to allow parallel fifths, and you're not going to allow parallel octaves. But at this earlier point, that's perfectly fine. They're saying, like, hey, that's a good idea. Well, let's put it in our treatise. Okay, and then let's look at these fourths again. Are they all perfect? From A up to, or from E to A is perfect fourth. D to G, E to A, D to G. C to F, yes, those are all perfect fourths. Okay, so what we can do is we can think of this whole piece as a recipe. So you're a composer, you got a melody. It's called Te humiles famuli modulis venerando piis, and the melody is. Okay. So then you're telling your friend, you're like, look, friend, come sing with me, okay? So I get to sing the melody. You're just going to accompany me. So first I want you to drone. Drone for a while. Then I want you to accompany me in parallel fourths until almost the end. So I'll just start again, and then I'll go to parallel fourths. And then, but find some way to meet me on the E by the last note. So we end up there together. That's a little recipe. So you're using the drone method, you're using the parallelism method, parallel fourths, and then you're just, at the end, you're ending on the cadence, which is on a presumably important note, which is E in this case. And then what I also just want to point out, one last thing, is like if we assume this is a whole phrase, and that makes sense with the words, it's starting on a unison, and it's ending on a unison. And it's ending on different unisons. Starts on G, ends on E. You know, in the context of this larger piece, we don't really know what the mode is. If we had just this passage, we would assume it's a mode on E. The E is the final. Anyway, we're starting on a consonant interval, a very stable consonant interval, the unison, and we're ending on a consonant stable interval. Again, the unison. So that's the most important thing I want you to notice. And just in comparison, look here, you have a second. Here you have a third, and they don't consider thirds to be very stable at this point. So in those various places, you have less stable notes. So you're certainly not starting on a second. You're not starting on a third. You're definitely starting on a strong note, which is unison, strong consonants. Here it is again. I don't know if you could hear it, but there's one thing that's different in this music from what the people are singing. I think they go to the E a little bit earlier in the organal voice. Okay, moving on. Some basic ideas of early organum. So this is a summary of stuff going on around 850 Common Era, so 9th century. There's always a pre-existing chant voice, which we could call the melody or the principal voice or the cantus firmus. Eventually, we'll call it the cantus firmus. In the early polyphonic writing, only one other voice is being added. So it isn't like, we're not doing 4-part writing. We're just adding one other voice. Later on, composers are going to add 3, 4 more voices. At this early stage, the principal voice is always above. And the new voice we're always adding below. Later, that will change. And then all or almost all intervals formed with the principal voice are consonant. We saw that in one case there was a major second, and in one case there was a major third, and they don't even consider thirds to be consonant yet. But most of them were unisons, fourths, fifths, octaves. So the intervals that they are considering consonant are the unison, the perfect fourth, perfect fifth, perfect octave. And I would like to point out that the perfect fourth, at this point, they definitely do consider it to be a consonance. But we will learn that around 1400, 1500, it's not considered a consonance anymore if it's, when we get into multiple voices, if a perfect fourth is in the upper voices, that's fine, but against the lowest voice in the texture, it'll be considered a dissonance. So just note that here the perfect fourth is considered a consonance. Later, it'll be kind of a dissonance. And then I would also like to point out that the perfect 11th and perfect 12th are considered consonants as two. And if you had a double octave, a perfect 15th, that would be considered a consonance. Those are compound intervals. And just pointing out that the compound intervals like the perfect 11th and 12th are really treated the same as their simple counterparts. So the perfect 11th is just like a perfect 4th, perfect 12th just like a perfect 5th. And the exceptions to this occur only during the held drone notes, like where we saw a major second. So, and then one last thing is that their tritones are being avoided. By tritone, I mean the augmented fourth or the diminished fifth. And how are they avoiding them? They're just changing one of the two notes. They're changing a B to a B flat, or they're changing an F to an F sharp, and that way they are altering the tritones to make them perfect fifths. And then a last-ish thing is that the ratio of the number of notes in each voice is 1-to-1. So for every note in the principal voice, one note is added in the contrapuntal voice. And then this is going to change toward the later 12th century. I think even later 12th century in the Notre Dame style of organum, which is called melismatic. And we'll see that at the end of this presentation. And now, for a brief little journey into Guido of Arezzo. Guido, one of the most famous music teachers of all time. He either invented or popularized the solfege syllables, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. He didn't use do, he called it ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and he didn't come up with ti. He just skipped it. They had to wait another several hundred years until he got the ti. But he's still very, let's thank him for that. And also the use of the 4-line staff. So eventually, of course, we have 5-line staves, but before that they were using sometimes just 1 or 2 or whatever. So this is an example of a chant that uses ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. That's where the syllables come from. We'll look at that at some point. And there's a picture of Guido. Here's another picture of Guido teaching someone on the monochord. And Guido also wrote in a treatise about organum. So it's kind of rare for music theorists of the past to have things that we still can read today and they tell us how stuff was done. So we're thankful for Guido for explaining this stuff. So Guido, it's very similar to what we're going to see in Kyriatis tradition from a little bit earlier, but this is about 200 years later than the stuff we just saw. So let's see what Guido thinks. For Guido, not only were the perfect consonances allowed between the voices, like unison, 4th, 5th octave, but so too were the major third and the major second. Now we saw those in passing when one of the voices was on a drone before, But now he's saying, like, look, you can just use the major third and use the major second. And that is really a big deal. He said the perfect fourth was preferable to the perfect fifth, but this notably was just because he thought the voices should be really close together. So perfect fifth, the voices are closer than, or perfect fourth, the voices are closer than in a perfect fifth. Major thirds, he said, were beautiful, which is, I think, one of the first times in music history where people are saying the major thirds are not just okay, but beautiful. And then minor thirds, he said, oh, they're just merely tolerated. Major seconds, he considered to be more consonant than minor thirds. So that is very interesting. Today, we definitely consider major seconds to be more dissonant than minor thirds. And then minor seconds, he said, were strictly forbidden. And then at the cadence, we'll look at this on the next page, just briefly. The voices, he recommended that they converge on the unison. And one last thing to note is that he said that voice crossing is okay. It is now allowed. And that means that the contrapuntal voice can either be above or below the principal voice. It can go both above and below. And we'll see that on the next page too. So these are just a couple of examples from Guido's treatise. So I'm going to play you the top line of stuff. What I wrote here is that Guido uses all three of these possibilities for converging to the unison at the end of the phrase, but then the second two of these would be not allowed in today's musical writing because it has some dissonances in them, parallel dissonances. So let's take a look at this. So first I'm going to play the top line. I'll play just the melody first. So the would look like whole notes. Okay, and then in the dark filled in notes, that's just droning on C. And then at the end, it goes up and joins the top voice on E. So that would sound together like. Okay, so that's pretty standard. That would be perfectly fine writing today. But he's also showing you different ways that you can end up at the unison at the end of the phrase, at the cadence. And then here are some examples. So I'm just going to play that second half. So I'm playing the second excerpt. So that's very crunchy in for today's, the way we hear stuff today. The last three notes. It's pretty unusual. And then also the one just below it. Okay, so that's a little bit strange to our ears today, but he was thinking those things were okay. So he really is thinking that the major seconds are okay, and even these parallel major seconds. We will normally say that parallel dissonances you would just never do. You don't even think about doing them. So, but that's okay for him. The main thing is that both the voices are ending on a unison at the end of the phrase. So this is just reminding us that cadences here, one of the main intervals that you're going to try to end on is the unison. And then this example at the bottom, where it says voice crossing, is going to show you that the principal voice, the melody, is allowed to go both above and below the droning voice, the organal voice. So I'll play just the melody first. And then the organal voice is just holding on a drone on F, but as a result, the melody voice is going both above it and then below it. So that is okay in Guido's time in 1025. Eventually, we'll see that composers try not to cross the voices. You can cross them, but if you're doing exercises, voice leading exercises, you don't cross the voices in the same way that if you're doing a crossword puzzle, you don't get to add new boxes and cross out boxes that you don't like, right? You have to kind of answer the questions the way the problem is set up. So when you do voice leading exercises, they're really set up sort of like crossword puzzles, and you try not to cross the voices. But in real music, you can cross voices. And now we have, so Guido's 1025. This is also sometime in around that century. We don't know who the composer is, but here is a chant that is set in 1-to-1 version, cuncti potens. The chant melody is below, and we heard it on a previous screen. So you're ignoring the top notes for now, and you're paying attention just to the low notes. Cuncti potens genitor Deus, omni creator, eleison. Right, and then if you went on, Christe Dei splendor, virtus patris que Sophia eleison. Okay, I won't do the third line, but we're looking at just the lower notes, and that's the chant that already exists. And then whoever the composer of this is has written the upper voice to go above it. So, Cuncti potens genitor eius. Okay. And to play those together, I'm just going to play you a recording of, I think this is Anonymous 4, which is a group that's singing this, and give a listen.
Cuncti potens genitor Deus, omni creator, eleison. Christe Dei splendor, virtus patris que Sophia eleison. Amorum sacrum spiramen exus amorque eleison.
And they do a little bit of decoration in there. So there's a couple places where you got lost. It's just because the upper voice is doing some fancy stuff. But let's take a look at this. Let's pay attention first to the interval between the voices for each of the verticalities. So we'll first give the generic interval and then go back and give the specific interval. So here we have a unison. Here we have a fifth. Here we have an octave. Here we have fifth, unison, fourth, 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 unison. And, we could go on, but might leave that to you in homework. We'll have to see. So then there's some general questions about intervals that we could ask. So which are the most common intervals? If we look at just this first phrase, we definitely have some unisons. We have fourths. We have two fifths. We have an octave. And we don't have anything else. So we could say the ones that are most common are unison, fifth, octave, fourth. Everything else is least common or not at all, which would be seconds, thirds, sixths. So now across the whole piece, what's the widest the two voices ever get? So here we have an octave. Let's see if there's anything bigger than an octave. Here, that's an octave. Ooh, that looks big, from D up to G. That's big. That's going to be an 11th, right? A compound fourth is an 11th. Octave, octave, octave. Okay, it looks like the 11th is the biggest. But most, other than that one place, they stay within an octave. Do the voices tend to move in parallel, similar, oblique, or contrary motion? And then for the parallel case, which intervals move in parallel? So I'm going to just point out to you, we haven't talked yet about this before, but if you have two voices, there's four possibilities of how they're going to move together. So if, in this case, let's say the chant melody is in the bottom. So A going to G is the chant. And the voice above is also going down, and this is a fifth, and this is a fifth. So that is called parallel. If they're both going down, but this is a fifth and this is something other than a fifth, then it's called similar, which we'll see here. Oblique motion means one voice is staying the same and another voice is moving. Similar motion, both voices are moving up, but it's going from a fourth to a third. So that's similar. Parallel is like a specific case of similar. Parallel means not only are they both going in the same direction, but the interval is the same. Perfect. Fifth, fifth. And then contrary motion here, but the top voice is going up, the bottom voice is going down, so they're always going in opposite directions. So that's called contrary motion. So in this, let's look at the beginning here. We have from kung to kti, we have one voice staying the same, one voice going up. So that would be oblique. Then here from kti to po, lower voice goes down, upper voice goes up, so that's contrary. Then they move contrary again, converging on tens. Then they move contrary again, converging on gen. Then they move contrary again to E. And then they move in parallel fourths, fourth, fourth on E toward De, and then contrary motion to us. So we had in there, we do have parallel motion, which is on fourths. We didn't have any similar motion. We do have oblique, and we do have contrary. So, beginnings and ends of phrases. Which intervals begin and end phrases? And I have this subordinate question, which is, does this differ between the smaller and the larger phrases? How do we know what a phrase is? How do we know what a phrase is? Definitely each line here that ends with what's like a little repeat sign, that's definitely a phrase. But then these little tiny marks, vertical marks, suggest that those are phrase endings too. So we can look at both the big phrases and the small phrases. So we'll look at the big phrases first. This big phrase starts on A, ends on D. That's an octave, and that's a unison, right? This one starts on a unison, ends on an octave, A and D again. This one starts on an octave, D, and ends on unison, A. So the big phrases are starting and ending on unisons or octaves. Then we can look within the little phrases, unison, 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 octave, octave, octave. This phrase, unison, 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 octave, fifth, octave, 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 unison, octave, fifth, unison. Okay, so we figured that out. And then the above question was about intervals, but we can ask the same thing with notes. So this is an A and a D. We saw that all the big phrases begin and end on D, on A or D. This one begins on A, ends on A, E, E, D. So in this whole phrase, the beginning and ending notes are A's, E's, and D's. Here we get an ending on F, beginning on G, beginning on an E, B, beginning on A, E, B, beginning on B's. So it looks like just about any note could be the beginning or end of a small phrase. But the beginnings and ends of the big ones are A's and D's. And I have been thinking about what mode this is in, and I'm a little confused. It's probably a mode on A, so it's probably like a transposed Dorian. I actually don't know what mode it is, so let's just ignore that. But A and D would be the main notes in this mode.
Cuncti potens genitor Deus, omni creator, eleison.
Okay. Now, a little bit later in time, that last one was 11th century, so 1000 something. Now we're at 1125, so early 12th century. We get Melismatic Organum. You can see we have the same chant melody, Cuncti potens. I'm playing just the whole notes there. But now each whole note is massively decorated. So listen to this beautiful recording, I think from the same group. So this is in the melismatic style. The chant voice holds each note for a long duration. Chant voice is now at the bottom. The organal voice performs melismas, many connected notes, over the chant drone, and just pointing out that the added voice, the organal voice, is now above the chant. Let's look at the beginnings and endings of phrases. If you look at between the voices generally, so I'll play at the beginning. So that's that first phrase. You can find just about all the diatonic intervals. So fifth, sixth, fifth, fourth, third, fourth, second, unison, right? So that's just about everything. But the beginnings and the ends of the phrases are still constrained, and the unison and the octave are the most preferred. And then you do have fifths. So at the beginning, T, so unison, octave eventually, and then unison. So those are the stressed intervals. The fifth is acceptable at a phrase beginning, as we can see at the very beginning, but it's not used at the end of phrases. So just octaves and unisons at the end of the phrase. And then you really don't see fourths here very much anymore. So I think we're going to look in more detail on the next page, but you'll see that, you'll see this more up close. Thirds are not yet being used in like a main structural way. They come in passing, but they're not big deal. So here, what I'm doing is I'm adding in the main notes in the upper voice, just so you can see which ones to consider the most important. And if you look at the ones that are circled, you're going to see that they're all forming octaves, fifths. There it is, 2/3 right there. Another third. Okay. But mostly fifths, octaves, and unisons. So on this page, I've just zoomed in a bit, and I've got those little circles for the main notes in the upper voice. And you can see here that I'm labeling the first one perfect fifth, second one perfect unison. So we're comparing the circled notes with the whole notes that are in the chant octave. So here's what it would sound like if I played just the whole notes and the circled notes. So it's actually not very interesting. I just played up to here to the A's. It's not super interesting on its own, but you can at least see that the main notes are perfect fifth, perfect unison, perfect octave. And that's about it. Every once in a while, a third. Here's what I'm going to have you do as one of the exercises on homework. Complete the analysis by labeling each vertical interval. In each case, the main note to choose from in the upper voice has been circled for you, and if it does not appear simultaneous with the onset of the lower note, it always appears after it. So what I mean by that is like this circle goes with that whole note. This circle goes with that whole note, meaning this circle doesn't go forward with that whole note, okay? And then for each phrase, I labeled them A, B, C, D, E, F. State the interval that begins the phrase and the interval that ends it. For unisons, also give the note name. So what I have here is that first phrase, A, has a perfect fifth at the beginning, and then it ends on a unison, and put that it's on A, because that way you can look at the whole thing and see if it ends on, if the unisons are always on A, for instance, or always on A and D, like in that other piece. Unison. Octave. Unison. Okay, and I'll just point out that the singers do stuff a little tiny bit different from what's here in some cases. So like I threw in an F sharp here and they didn't. And then they're putting this B, I think, around here or here. So, but anyway, when you're doing the analysis, do it based on what it looks like on the page. And just for a last thing, this happens at the end of the 12th century. And here we are doing organum, but we're bringing in rhythm. So just give a listen to this. It's called it's Notre Dame Organum. So just going to go ahead and give you a little summary. In the 9th century, 11th century, early 11th century, early 12th century, and then later 12th century. So we looked at parallel organum, free organum, melismatic organum, rhythmicized organum. For parallel organum, the types of motion we saw were both parallel and oblique. The ratio of notes was 1-to-1, and the preferred intervals were perfect fifth, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, perfect octave. There would be perfect unison, but then it wouldn't even be parallel organum at all. It would just be everybody singing the same line. In the 11th century, with free organum, the types of motion you see are contrary, parallel, and oblique. And then with the parallel intervals, they had parallel unisons, which is unusual. There were parallel fourths, and then there are even parallel major seconds, which we looked at with Guido, right? And that's kind of weird for today, at least. Oblique, and then it looked, in the examples that we saw, there wasn't any similar motion, but there probably is somewhere in that repertoire, just like maybe not in the examples we saw. And then Guido did allow voice crossing. So the ratio of notes was still 1-to-1. The preferred intervals were perfect fourth and perfect fifth. Guido said that the fourth was better, but that's just because that kept the voices closer together. You could also use major thirds and major seconds, and that's kind of new in music history in 1025. And the minor third was tolerated, but the minor second was forbidden. And then the cadences, typically they would converge on the unison, or they could diverge and end on an octave. With melismatic organum, we saw that most of the motion is oblique, because the chant voice just holds the note for a long time, and then the upper voice gets to move around real fancy. The ratio of notes was many to one. Contrapuntal voice was above now for the first time. And then the preferred intervals at the beginnings and ends of phrases would be on fifths and octaves and unisons. So the same ones as before. So you get to see all the intervals throughout. But at phrase beginnings and ends, you have the standard ones: perfect fifth, perfect octave, unison. Then finally, with that rhythmicized organum on that last page, it's all the same stuff as in the melismatic organum. It's just that now, so I'm going to skip all this, but at the end, you see that there's also a limited set of rhythmic possibilities. So I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but with the rhythmic modes, they didn't have all these choices. They could just go da 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 da, or da 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 da, or da 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 da. I mean, or different combinations of those things. So there's not really a lot that they could do with rhythms. But rhythmicized organum would use those possible rhythms. But it's still going to use those same ideas of one note holding for a long time and another note doing a bunch of fancy stuff above it. Okay, so lastly, I just want to play you some polyphonic music from all over the world. I mentioned at the beginning that it tends to be thought of that polyphony is a crowning achievement of Western art music, and it's true. But there is polyphonic singing in cultures all over the world. So here's just a little sampling. This is from Bulgaria. So notice the droning and also the really crunchy intervals that just sound beautiful. is another case of a drone and melody over the top. This is music from Corsica. Neutral third there. A third kind of between major and minor.
Primo viso de gusta terradinha.
It's four-part singing. There's two upper voices that sing fairly normally, whereas the lower voices were singing in a very nasal tone, which is just part of the style. This is from Georgia, meaning the country. It's music of the Maasai people from East Africa. Music from Tanzania. These are two examples from the Aka people. Also from the Aka people. And last is the San people, also known as the Bushmen of the Kalahari. Okay, well, that's just about all we have. Thanks for listening, and I hope that this wide and long temporal introduction to what polyphony is and can be, it gives you wide and creative ideas of what you can do with polyphony.